Oh yeah, it doesn't have to be on for you actually, so that's good. It's not. It's just a facade, a charade, as they say.
Be whispering things under my breath into it for the people who aren't.
They're kind of annotated. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Lily. It's a problem to be known to me in this room. Welcome to this afternoon Center for Science Studies Thursday colloquium. It's a real pleasure to welcome Chris Kelty here for our spring discussion, our spring colloquium series. Chris Kelty is known to many of you in this room as the author of 2 Bits, a rather remarkably wonderful account of the open source software movement, and more to the point of the geeks and hackers who made it all happen. Chris is an insanely widely published, knowledgeable, active public intellectual. I'm going to call you a public intellectual. Chris is a public intellectual on all matters internet and their related ancillary themes. He is currently an associate professor of information studies at the Center for Society and Genetics at UC Los Angeles. He has just written, among other things, a piece in Science called 58 Ways of Looking at a Blackberry, which I'm guessing is probably not the fruit, but it might be. He's written a review in this center's own Historical Studies in the Natural Sciences, HSNS, called Steal This Review, and you can guess what that's about. He's widely published on matters of nanotechnology, society, and ethics. Has written in the rather tasty journal Crowd. It's a very fashionable journal, it is. It's written intensely and wonderfully and acutely about questions of copyleft, of openness, of what it means to live in an internet-mediated age right now. So he is our guide through many things that many of us need languages for, have not been able to figure them out, and Chris tells us what to think, and we are very grateful to him for that. Today he's going to be speaking about the fog of freedom, liberty and lock-in in the age of the internet. Please join me in welcoming Chris Kelty.
I think you used up all the adverbs in introducing me. All the adverbs in the room. Hello to everyone who's not here. It's going to be a secret dialogue between me and the people who are watching from afar. All right. Right. So, thank you very much for the chance to talk to you about this project that I'm engaged in, labeled The Fog of Freedom, which is actually part of a book. I keep calling it a book in the hopes that it will become a book as I work on it, that has a focus on the subjects of freedom, responsibility, and participation. And these are, as you might imagine, pretty well traversed and exquisitely explored topics, especially freedom and responsibility, so I've had to work up a lot of hubris in order to talk about these concepts. If anything, my interest in them is driven by a concern very dear to work in science studies and technology studies, which is that sort of concern with how artifacts have politics, how technology, how values are built into technologies, how technology is society made durable, etc. But a concern with trying to actually dig a little deeper and figure out exactly which values we're talking about and how. So we're very good at showing in science studies, especially in detailed historical and ethnographic work, how this process of making technologies political happens, but we do it on a kind of case-by-case basis. And we often treat politics we often treat the politics of artifacts or the values being built in or the society being made durable as a kind of independent variable. It doesn't really matter which values or which society. And rather than a kind of specific one, which is what I kind of want to do with these concepts of freedom, responsibility, and participation. So the hubris involved in writing about these concepts is born of a desire to establish a more rigorous understanding of what it might mean to make freedom, responsibility, and participation doable today. In particular, when people think they're building things with respect to these concepts, and they make things in one way rather than another because they think it enhances freedom, what exactly are they doing, right? So obviously, given the title of the talk, I'll talk about freedom today and not responsibility and participation. I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about responsibility in the context of work I did on nanotechnology there and written a couple of papers about responsibility in that context. I have a research project on participation, which is unlike freedom and responsibility, particularly untraveled ground in philosophy, though it's of obvious interest to people working on new media today. And the section on freedom then starts with a kind of intuition that has permeated my work on new media all along in the history of computers, softwares, networks, hackers, geeks, etc., which I've never really actually been able to articulate very clearly. And the intuition has to do with the nature of freedom, and I'll try and demonstrate throughout the talk how central I think this concept's been to the history of information technology, but also how confused, hence the fog. So the intuition is that there's a kind of a pathological relationship in the IT industry, in particular, my friends across the bay there in Silicon Valley, a pathological relationship to freedom that it cannot correct through the normal course of innovation. And the pathology, I think, concerns this relationship between innovation, that is engineering, design, the legal aspects of intellectual property law and customs on the one hand, and public freedom, between the mechanisms for reward and the mechanisms for limiting arbitrary power. And economists and legal scholars would likely think of this as a problem of monopoly power, but I think of it as a more properly cultural one, and in particular a cultural problem of freedom that can't be solved simply by regulatory force or government intervention, and certainly not technologically. So what I want to demonstrate here is that in the case of information technologies in particular, and perhaps for other areas, the attempt to engineer freedom has guided a very large range of projects and developments in this field, but these attempts just as often seem to fail, introducing instead a new sense of constraint and control, an unfreedom that contrasts sharply with the ideal of freedom that went into building them in the first case, which in turn creates new problems to solve and a new need to engineer freedom anew. And I think that this process, this cycle, has been going on in the IT industry from the beginning. And I'm trying to figure out exactly how one might articulate that pathology. I'm going to just keep calling it a pathology. It may not be. Maybe it's actually healthy, but I don't think so. So the result of this pathology is that we've created or recreated over and over again new tools that kind of promise freedom, but which promptly become new tools of domination. It's not clear to me where this cycle ends or if it does, but the goal of this talk is simply to demonstrate for you that it's happening, and that it has something to do with the fact that we do not think clearly about freedom or why we want it. So let me start by trying to convince you, if you need to be convinced, that we generally associate freedom with information technology. This, deliberately, like this, you can't see it, but you can perform this experiment at home. It's a Google image search for freedom, which gives you an array of wonderful images. And it may be hard to convince you that information technology is associated with freedom because, as you can see, we seem to associate freedom with everything. These uses come from both the left and the right. They have a kind of visual consistency to them, images of upheld arms, liberated birds, broken chains, etc. When a logo emphasizes a flag, a gun, or an eagle, it is more obviously right-leaning. When it uses a sans serif font, the color green, or a raised fist, it's more likely left-leaning. But generally speaking, it's a kind of very familiar array of images and sort of visual metaphors. You can perform this, actually get a strikingly different array if you look for liberty or justice, which is both of which are very uniform in what they return, as opposed to this, which actually has some diversity to how it's organized, or sustainability or anything. So you can play around with this, right? So it's not surprising to find many small and large operations today branding themselves with freedom imagery. Right? So we have Honeywell's Total Freedom software. We've got the iFreedom suite of products. And we've got the Freedom Computers LLC in Florida, who says that as of 2011, Freedom Computers continues to strive and is now more freedomier than ever before. which I think is just a Colbert effect, quite frankly. But there are, of course, the very obvious versions of this. This is the most obvious case, and one that we'll return to. Microsoft agrees, though they're much more subtle about it, perhaps because they recognize the irony. And there are plenty of sincere examples. So, for instance, the many academics and professionals and politicians concerned about issues of privacy, surveillance, interference with academic freedom. You have your Freedom to Tinker blog, started by Ed Felton at Princeton, or the Computers, Freedom, and Privacy group. And then, of course, there's the specific concern with freedom of speech on the Internet, which is often confused with the freedom of the Internet itself. And the association between freedom and the Internet in the case of, for instance, net neutrality specifically raises the question of innovation, namely who gets to do it and who should be favored to pursue it. So if you pay attention, it's not just freedom per se which is at issue in those cases, but a kind of justice, and in particular justice is fairness. And I'll also return to that aspect of it, because this is something which comes up repeatedly in debates about neutrality, and which anyone who is a political theorist should hear with Rawlsian ears. That a government be neutral with respect to definitions of the good is transmuted into a network that is neutral with respect to who innovates and how. And here, this is a slide that I got from Annalena Schiller, and it has a kind of direct connection between net neutrality and one particular kind of freedom, creative freedom, a kind of version of autonomous or positive freedom, which I'll return to. And then, of course, there's a free software, perhaps the most zealously promoted of the associations between freedom and computers, and perpetually struggling to disambiguate itself, right? The classic tagline, free as in speech, not as in beer, to disambiguate the free of freedom with the free of free software here from the Computer Shopper magazine, the best free software you need in hard times, which turns out to be actually open source software once you click through, though they're advertising it as free. And free software has spawned other technologies as well. So Eben Moglen of the Free Software Foundation of Software Freedom and Privacy Center in New York has created the Freedom Box, a small technology to replace cloud computing. The Freedom Phone, an experiment in providing mobile telephony in Africa. All these technologies deal with a kind of nexus of freedom, privacy, control, intellectual property. There's also a robust interest in freedom from computers, exemplified by one of the most ingenious pieces of software available, called Freedom, of course, which shuts down your access to the Internet for however long you actually want to work. They also make software called Antisocial, which does the same thing with your social networks. It's either the best $10 you'll ever spend or a profound confirmation that there's a sucker born every minute. And then, of course, lately, over the last year, Internet freedom has begun to be confused with freedom generally throughout the media, if not only in North Africa. So freedom here becomes a kind of cipher for imperial power, and freedom of the Internet as a kind of statecraft practiced by the State Department. So you see Secretary of State Clinton there with her Internet freedom talks around the world, as well as the association of Facebook and Twitter with the revolutions in North Africa. My favorite version of this is an amazing association of freedom with Twitter and horror. These are France 24 television shows about the revolutions called the Tweets, which take off on the Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. So, but what kind of freedom and organized how? Needing power. So let's just say the case is made that we associate freedom with information technology. Is this more than rhetorical, right? More than cynical? What kind of freedom are we talking about, organized how? I think for most Americans, the appeal to freedom needs to be approached with a healthy dose of prophylactic skepticism. It's true that there's no more jingoistic word in our politicians' vocabularies today. But to me, I think this means redoubling the effort to treat the word with some respect and to explore the contours of the concept it refers to. Because it turns out that if you stop and look a little, there are a lot of really sophisticated ways to think about the concept. And while this sophistication is routinely applied, for instance, by lawyers arguing freedom of speech before the Supreme Court, or political theorists arguing in pages of academic journals is almost never carefully considered in the domain of information technology and new media, which I find frustrating. So forgive me if this is a kind of remedial approach to the concept of freedom for some, but I think that in the context of thinking about new media, there needs to be a richer vocabulary or a richer set of distinctions for analyzing what the relationship is between freedom and information technology. So the first thing to say about freedom and computers is that it's about more than libertarianism. Now, this is the nearly default mode of critique on the left, which is to associate Silicon Valley, especially, with libertarianism, and especially to associate libertarianism with Ayn Rand. And this is really not an unreasonable association, especially when you have people like Peter Thiel, who you saw in The Social Network, the initial investor in Facebook, funding things like the Seasteading Institute to set up autonomous, to further the establishment and growth of permanent autonomous ocean communities enabling innovation and new political and social systems, or paying youngsters literally to drop out of high school and college. So it's certainly not impossible to find devotees of Rand or avowed libertarians of various stripes. But I think the association has become a kind of myth of its own. It has its own ideology. So one origin point for this is 1995 article by Richard Barbrook and Andy Cameron called The Californian Ideology, whose nuance was, and it's widely read, people probably still read it in new media classes today, its nuance was to recognize that the ideology they refer to combines elements of both traditional left and traditional right, bringing together ostensible lefties like Stuart Brand with ostensible conservatives like Newt Gingrich and George Gilder. And the piece mixes sort of fast and loose characterizations of this new class of powerful elites. The California consensus echoes ideology echoes the Washington consensus, and sort of somewhat predictable screeds about the reproduction of existing race, class, and social inequality, and spirited replays of the epic struggle between the state and the free market. This is their version of things, and that really sedimented this relationship. And so in 2001, then, there was another book that I think fairly widely read by Paulina Borsa called Cyber Selfish, a critical romp through the terribly libertarian culture of high tech, in which she savages the feral techno-libertarians of high-tech culture. Right? And recently, there's a 6-hour-long Adam Curtis documentary. Thank you, Lily Arani, for pointing me to this. I didn't watch all 6 hours, I'm sad to say. But it takes the story even further, and in the process implicates a lot of things. 1960s systems theory and ecology, Richard Dawkins' theory of the selfish gene, civil war in Congo, the Rwandan genocide, the Chinese Politburo. I think, in some ways, Adam Curtis's enthusiasm for this association really leaves us just short of a really sort of swinging conspiracy theory. There's actually a really great 3-minute version on YouTube that you can watch. It was a send-up of it, which is called The Loving Trap. I recommend that one. Has anybody seen Adam Curtis movies? No? Okay, so he actually did one on freedom as well, which is a kind of extraordinary, foil for what I'm doing today, because he goes through a lot of the same kinds of things, but with much more gusto, I would say. So Fred Turner's book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, is really the only one so far. Well, there's a few others, but the first one really to dissent from, or maybe to, I guess, put it in scholarly terms, robustly historicize this story of libertarianism out of control. And his story tracks the hybrid political position deeper into the 1960s, distinguishing between, on the one side, the new left, and on the other side, the new communalists, who turned away from political action and turned towards technology and the transformation of consciousness as the primary sources of social change. So it was works of people like Theodore Roszak in The Making of Counterculture and Charles Reich, The Greening of America, that really provided templates for a new kind of social change in the 1960s, beyond, outside, or perhaps within the failed systems of contemporary governance and political action. What seemed to make this story surprising is the countercultural embrace of technology. Right? Rather than the conventional association of hippies with back to nature, anti-technological, Turner really shows how there was an embrace of technology in this period, and especially of things like cybernetics, system theory, Norbert Wiener, Buckminster Fuller, the personal computer, and not this conventional association of communalist hippies with Luddism or pre-technological naturalisms. So on the contrary, it becomes a story of the wresting of technology away from the maws of bureaucracy, hierarchy, organization, man, the association of technology with consciousness. So without wanting to deny that Silicon Valley libertarians exist, and I've certainly met my fair share of them in Silicon Valley and around the world, I want to suggest that they really only represent one aspect of the story of the relationship between freedom and information technology. There are a diversity of political associations, and the sophistication with which people in the high-tech industry think about freedom and other values, I think, outweighs the vocal minority's simplistic utopia. There's a lot of diversity here. Freedom, it turns out, can mean a lot of things. Indeed, as Isaiah Berlin put it in his famous essay, it is a concept so porous that there is little interpretation it seems able to resist. So I think the only route, then, is to start exploring some of the well-worn distinctions that have been forged by philosophers and political theorists. And again, forgive me for this sort of remedial approach. It's been remedial for me to go back through this and to think about what these distinctions meant when they were made and whether or not they're applicable to information technology. And so I want to kind of go through them and give you examples from the history of information technology and think about how well they can be used to help explain what's going on. And this is a short list of possible versions of freedom. So I'll just start at the beginning then, with negative liberty. Most everyone's probably been forced at some point to read or pretend to read Isaiah Berlin's short article, Two Concepts of Liberty, in which he didn't really introduce a new distinction, but kind of rehearsed for a new generation this distinction between positive and negative liberty. And negative liberty, which is often wrongly associated with libertarianism, in my opinion, is a zone of coercion, where liberty is defined narrowly as its absence, the absence of coercion. I am free only insofar as I'm not directly restrained or coerced by other human beings. It's a definition which has the virtue of simplicity, but the problem that it describes almost no case in reality. So, some quotes. Coercion implies the deliberate interference of other human beings within the area in which I wish to act. You lack political liberty of freedom only if you're prevented from attaining your goal by other human beings. So there's a goal, there are other human beings, there's interference. This is a core part of the understanding of negative liberty. And what he also says about it is that liberty, in the sense, is principally concerned with the area of control, not with its source. Just as democracy may, in fact, deprive the individual citizen of a great many liberties which he might have in some other form of society, so it is perfectly conceivable that the liberal-minded despot would allow his subjects a large measure of personal freedom. And this will be important for other critiques of this distinction as well. Positive liberty, then, on the other hand, is that tradition which sees liberty as something which the individual must attain. Not freedom from, but freedom to. Given this definition, it might be surprising that Berlin suggests that positive liberty is no better than a specious disguise for brutal tyranny. He's pretty clear on which side he's going to come down. But he has a kind of stirring, long passage about all the things that positive liberty are. I wish my life and decisions to depend on myself, not on external forces of whatever kind. I want to be the instrument of my own, not other men's acts of will. I want to be subject, not an object, so on. This goes on for like half a page, this stirring thing, which is a specious disguise for brutal tyranny. But what makes positive liberty dangerous is not its visions of autonomy or self-actualization per se, but the attempt by any organization or state or powerful entity to impose this particular form of freedom on others. So it's evil, by most definitions of freedom, to restrict freedom in the name of freedom. Right? As well-worn concepts of liberty, positive and negative liberty divide up the concept of freedom into these two large areas concerning the freedom of the individual. The source of freedom, the area of control. And the principal problem, according to Berlin, with positive liberty, is this sense that it can be used to coerce others. So one thing to note about the libertarian myth about Silicon Valley is simply that it stumbles on this distinction. Libertarians are fierce partisans of negative liberties in some cases, protesting attempts to enforce ideals of the good, of welfare, or of individual access. But they're seen by their critics as pushing a particular kind of positive liberty, a vision of well-being that is resolutely individualist and radically divorced from any sense of communal or collective organization, a belief they seek to enshrine in ever stronger legal protections of property, although, interestingly, not always intellectual property. So, curious fact about libertarians. So what makes libertarians scary to those who denounce them is not that they want to be let alone, but precisely the fact that they seem to want to legislate a particularly loathsome version of radically individual freedom on others. So the association of Silicon Valley with libertarianism, even the modified libertarianism Barbrook's Californian ideology or of Turner, seem to struggle with this definition of freedom. Or to put it differently, if there's something to be concerned about with Silicon Valley's approach to liberty, it's not that it's overly libertarian, but that it is a kind of positive liberty imposed not through government action, but through the creation and dissemination of technology, which coerces us in ways that interfere with our goals. So, as many things as with many things, there's some truth to this, and it is a truth primarily associated with the rise of the personal computer. As Berlin notes, the distinction between negative and positive liberty has the function of making a logical distinction between the area of control and the source of control. And insofar as we're talking about political liberty, that source has always been considered the government, and only secondarily church, society, corporations, or perhaps technology. So this is one version of what of freedom that we might use to think about the history of information technology. And this tension between positive and negative liberty is something we might see clearly in certain key moments in the liberation of computing from the 1960s forward, and with the personal computer, and especially Apple's personal computer, which I'll come to. One of the many virtues of both Fred Turner's account, and there's a more recent one by Thomas Streeter about the history of computing, is that they remind us how the computer was once identified with bureaucratic, centralized, and standardized corporations. Computers exemplified instrumental reason and the separation of means and ends, and they were associated with organization man and with the military-industrial complex, with the closed world of destructive military power. So they served as emblems for protesters in the 1960s decrying the psychological inauthenticity of mainstream American life. Turner's book even begins with the very meaning of computers for free speech activist Mario Savio in the 1960s, right outside the building, right? At Cal, you're little more than an IBM card, how his book starts. So significant in this, then, is the choice of IBM, the largest monopoly in American history, or one of the largest, not sure about that claim. And the punch card, the emblem of so-called batch processing, by which means and ends were effectively separated into problems and calculations. This was just as true for people outside the industry, wearing their do not fold, spindle, or mutilate buttons, as it was for people inside the industry who rejected the ideas of mainframes, batch computing, and the high priests of programming. It was the liberation from restrictions and coercions, not just of the computer, but of the mid-century corporation, which gave many of the earliest participants a real boost in associating the computer with the individual and with freedom. So Streeter, Tom, in his book, and Turner as well, and also Mitchell Waldrop, who wrote a book about him, single out J.C.R. Licklider as one example of this. And he was an early program director at the Information Processing Techniques Office at ARPA, the place where what at the time he was calling the Galactic Network was first imagined. As one of the few individuals in the 1960s who would have had more or less unrestricted time in front of a computer, Licklider constantly sang the praises of interactivity and the power of the computer to augment, not to replace, human thought. His famous paper, Man-Computer Symbiosis, suggested a kind of crypto-cyborgian path towards a new humanity, an augmented intelligence greater than anything humans were capable of as individuals. For Licklider and others at the time, what restricted the liberty of thought was not so much other humans, though they were implicated, but the design of the machines, the design itself. It was not interactive. It was not symbiotic. It was not playful enough. So here you have various versions of this. Irving Sutherland inventing Sketchpad, graduate students at MIT playing Space War, which is, of course, one of the first things they made their PDP-1 do, not anything more productive, right? And the most famous notion of augmented thought, sort of purest form, is Douglas Engelbart's version of design. Probably the most storied demonstration in computer history was Engelbart's demonstration in 1968 in San Francisco and Stanford of the online system, which included basically all of the elements that we recognize today: the mouse, word processing, files, cut and paste, many other things that are easily recognizable as absolutely central to the personal computer. And Engelbart, much more than Licklider even, saw the goal of a more personal computer in terms of positive liberty, something which literally augmented human intelligence, allowing us to achieve things we could not achieve before and deal with the complexity of a rapidly growing, rapidly advancing society. A freedom to rather than a freedom from. His work directly and indirectly influenced a generation of engineers. So this version of positive liberty, the freedom to think, to do more than humans could do by themselves, was clearly present then in the work of people like Seymour Papert and Alan Kay, both of whom clearly associated personal freedom with education and childhood, and a desire to bring computers to them, to make it possible for all humans to augment their intelligence and their freedom. And here's the objection: whether or not they wanted to. So Alan Kay is responsible for the Dynabook. If you've not heard about the Dynabook, it's the 1967 version of the iPad. Here are the children using it. Seymour Papert created Mindstorms, these great toys for children to learn to program and understand programming languages. He was also a scholar of Piaget's work and sort of attempted to think about children learning technology through the philosophy of Piaget. And both of them wanted to bring these tools to as wide a community as possible through various means. But perhaps the most emblematic document of this form of personal computers as positive liberty was Ted Nelson's Computer Lib Dream Machines book, which was explicitly modeled on the Whole Earth Catalog and bearing the exhortation, "You can and must learn computers now." There's our raised fist, right? The book surveyed the whole of computer culture in 1974, including legal, copyright, and other issues, introduced the idea of hypertext writing, and explained in a distinctive countercultural style all kinds of engineering and computer science lingo and ideas. The book was liberally sprinkled with illustrations from R. Crumb, as well as from the Wizard of Oz books. And here he is actually much later in his life with his proprietary Xanadu system, which is just an interesting footnote. Nelson was, I had dinner with him actually recently, and he was far less eccentric than I had hoped he would be. So really a disappointment. What's up with these 70s countercultural types? Nelson was fanatical about making the right kinds of design decisions about what computers should be like now, i.e. in the 70s, and not later. His version of freedom was both negative and positive, and it included elements of resisting control and surveillance, but it also projected a resolutely countercultural vision of creativity, expression, and individual growth. Now, the enemy in this parallel of the growth of the personal computer was rarely the government. Sometimes it was big corporations like IBM or later AT&T, here figured as the Death Star. There's actually apparently a famous one with the X-Wing fighter has got labeled Unix going in to destroy AT&T's Death Star, but I can't find an image of it. Apocryphal. But there were always other corporations, like DEC and its PDP minicomputers, who represented a resistance within the industry. More generally, the enemy was that technological innovation system itself. Right? Nelson's book is replete with anxiety that the course of innovation as it exists will restrict rather than enhance freedom. Licklider was always excoriating his scientists for their approach to computing, and not treating it as something which enhanced human or augmented human thought, but restricted it. And in Engelbart, the very core of his idea of augmentation is in some ways a design process, which he called bootstrapping. And there's a fantastic book about this by Terry Bartini called Bootstrapping, which is about Engelbart's understanding of human augmentation. The wrong kind of engineering and the wrong kind of design were the enemies. The people needed protection from these top-down megacorporations. They needed to create art and beauty with a computer, as Stephen Levy would later capture in his book on hackers. Now, if this sounds like Steve Jobs, it should, because the purest expression of this need for computer as the enabler of positive freedom came in January of 1984. You don't remember this because you were watching the Super Bowl. I don't even remember who was playing. Yeah, was it? It was 19, yeah. Can't remember.
It's the only reason I would have been watching.
So this is a version of Apple Computer as the first company to make good on this particular promise of positive freedom, to offer to restrict users' freedoms in the name of freedom, to offer convenience, ease of use, simplicity as a route towards the dream of computer lib imagined by Alan Kay, Seymour Papert, or Ted Nelson, and to explicitly offer it to everyone, to consumers, a kind of populist corporate paternalism, a war for freedom fought against endlessly renewed enemies, the engineers, the bureaucrats, the bean counters, and against the forces of ugliness. If you've read Steve Jobs' biography, this is all over it, right? There you go. So, positive and negative liberty are one way of thinking about these things, but they tend to focus a little too much on the individual. And it's not surprising that the rise of the personal computer can be so easily understood in these terms. But there are other distinctions that one could make with respect to the concept of freedom, and one of those is between individual liberty and collective liberty. Sometimes negative liberty is associated with individual freedom and positive liberty with collective issues, and sometimes individual free will is opposed to issues of political liberty and liberalism. At the heart of the problem, and it is important for what one means by freedom, is whether we believe in the existence of collective subjects. Most resist the idea on the simple intuition that a collective subject can be nothing other than the sum of individual minds. But if freedom is, at least in part, the capacity to be held responsible for an action, then it's clear that we routinely attribute this kind of agency to collectives, most obviously to corporations. Right? We've enshrined it in Supreme Court decisions only just recently. But so too nations, movements, collectivities of various sorts. So the question of collective liberty then, I think, confronted engineers, especially engineers working on networked computing, very early on. And it confronts them as a problem of governance. What makes a network free? How can a network be made responsible? How can it be made fair? It's not an accident that the problem of designing the internet occupied engineers at precisely the same time that the problem of designing a neutral and fair democracy occupied John Rawls, for instance. Both of them were dealing with a similar kind of problem of what later would come to be called net neutrality, or neutrality generally, but in terms of networks, network neutrality. But it starts with time-shared operating systems, which emerged in the 1960s as one route of attack on and resistance to that mainframe culture. It was pitched as a kind of corrective to the inefficiency, hierarchy, and bureaucracy of batch processing. And it's a kind of ingenious idea. So if you batch process, everybody gets in line with their cards, and they get a chance to use the computer. Time sharing took all of the idle CPU time that wasn't being used in between each of those things and basically chopped it up into a bunch of little slices and let everyone use the computer at the same time, giving everyone the appearance that they had direct access to the computer, even though they were only getting one slice of the time, which came around cyclically. So maybe you got 1/60th of a second, but it was moving so fast you didn't notice. So it looked like you had access to the computer. And it allowed multiple users the appearance of having the computer to themselves and the freedom to explore the computer in a more or less real-time kind of interaction, as opposed to one mediated by technicians and managers. So freedom here is less positive or negative than a question of equality and fairness, of balance, of how to design a system that equitably allows everyone a chance at freedom. And the idea really took off because time sharing was perceived as a freedom-promising innovation that would also bring computing to everyone and every home in the form of a computer utility. If one could share computing resources to multiple terminals in the next room, why not the whole country? As a kind of welfare vision of computing, the idea of computer utility faced the same kinds of political problems other utilities did. How to be both universally accessible as a standardized utility and part of a competitive market that would grow a new industry. Utility computing, as a side note, has succeeded and failed over and over again since about 1967. And its most recent attempt is called cloud computing, I would argue. So when you think of cloud computing, there's a long tradition of people trying to figure out how to do this kind of very widespread sharing. And this is a nice article from 1968 about sharing your computer. I love the scare quotes there, your computer. This is obviously troubling that it doesn't belong to someone, even before the era of the personal computer. Right? A remarkably similar problem was at the heart of ARPANET's design, and in particular the design of the TCP/IP protocols that still structure what's left of the Internet today. The design of the TCP/IP protocols was a clever way to solve the problem of what they were calling at the time administratively bounded networks that wanted to share resources. So those protocols, TCP/IP protocols, are called Internet protocols for a particular reason, which is that there were lots of different networks with their own resources and computing power, which wanted to share between different networks, but they wanted to maintain administrative control over their own network. And so these protocols were a solution to that. And although ARPANET was a military-funded experiment, it was not controlled by the DoD, but by academics with a particular vision of the simultaneous need for autonomy and interoperability. Existing installations and networks should be allowed to develop and evolve as they see fit, but to share resources and communicate in a standardized fashion that required protocols and gateways that normalized information traffic across regions, bounded regions, administratively bounded regions. And so these constitutional aspects of the system became apparent as soon as one thinks about of it as a solution to this sort of problem of governance. TCP/IP appears as a constitutional guarantee of the interacting freedoms of individuals, a system of checks and balances, as it were, between individuals, the specific computer network, and a collective subject, everyone on the Internet together. And it's interesting, actually, in the design documents that were written ex post facto after this came to be, there's actually a very nice list. There's a particular article by David Clark, which is quoted here, of the order in which priorities were kind of conceived in the design of the Internet. And things like security are at the very bottom, right? Security and also military robustness, right? So, but at the very top are things like interoperability and the ability to communicate, share resources across these boundaries. So there's a clear hierarchy of the design principles that went in to that work. A third case that is a kind of interesting moment of individual versus collective freedom is the development of the Unix operating system. And this illustrates several different aspects of freedom. But Unix itself was a time-shared operating system, and it was one that figured the existing time-shared operating systems as the enemy. Right? They were bulky, they were hierarchical, they were bureaucratic and inefficient. It was going to be, as Ken and Dennis, the people who invented it, joked, one of whatever Multics was many of. Multics was a previous time-shared operating system. And it was going to be a kind of elegant solution to the problem of creating time-shared operating systems. And it was. It absolutely created the most widely used, most portable version of an operating system that could be used on any system anywhere in the world and was shared very widely. It represented a kind of liberation from domination. Ken and Dennis changed the existing system of operating system construction, which was essentially confined within corporations, by inventing a process whereby the source code to Unix was shared widely, ported to various machines, and the improvements reincorporated into a kind of semi-official version. And the result was that Unix spread like wildfire around the world and became virtually synonymous with the idea of an operating system by the 1980s. So you get textbooks that are like computer science textbooks, principles of operating systems, and by that they mean principles of the Unix operating system, not anything else. And here's just a nice story that I tell in the book as well, in 2 bits, about John Lyons, who was one of the people who ported Unix to a different system and who created a thing called Lyons Commentary on Unix 6th edition. It was a commentary on the source code that circulated very widely and illegally because AT&T tried to restrict him. And there's a quote at the beginning of it. We soon came into possession of what looked like a 5th-generation photocopy, and someone who shall remain nameless spent all night in the copy room spawning a 6th, an act expressly forbidden by a carefully worded disclaimer on the first page. 4 remarkable things were happening at the same time. 1, we discovered the first piece of software that would inspire rather than annoy us. 2, we had acquired what amounted to a literary criticism of that computer software. 3, we were making the single most significant advancement in our education in computer science by actually reading an entire operating system. And 4, we were breaking the law. Clear. Now, one of the reasons why there's a sort of irony here, and one not unrelated to the problem of freedom, the only reason that was possible to do this, both Unix and the Unix commentary on the source code, was because of the restrictions placed on its ostensible owner, AT&T. A consent decree in 1956 restricted the company AT&T from doing anything but engaging in activities of telecommunications, voice traffic, essentially. So they had Bell Labs and they had a huge research wing working on computers, but they couldn't commercialize it, right, under this consent decree because it would have been an antitrust action on their part. And so instead, they very, very widely licensed many of the technologies that they were investing in instead of trying to turn them into products. And this ended in 1984 with the breakup of the company and the end of the monopoly, and ushered in a whole new era of a kind of what were in the 1980s called the Unix Wars, or the Open Systems Wars, which I talk about in my book. So, now, there's another tradition of freedom in our culture, however, and one that periodically reappears and goes by the name of Republican or Civic Republican liberty. And it's a tradition associated usually with folks like Machiavelli, Rousseau, de Tocqueville, the founding fathers of the United States. And it's, I think, a compelling vision of freedom. Freedom in republicanism is freedom from domination. To understand why this is so distinctive, many Republican theorists rely on some version of what is called the paradox of the contented slave. Republicans, for the most part, reject any attempt at positive liberty, just as partisans of negative liberty do, but they also reject negative liberty because it leads to the possibility that one could be a slave with a particularly benevolent master, one who never actually interferes with the slave's freedom. This contented slave remains a slave, always subject to the arbitrary whim of the master, even if that whim is never realized. For most people, the idea that a slave can be considered free is simple contradiction. The same argument can be mounted at the collective level by imagining a contented colony, subject to the rule of a benevolent empire, possessing absolute freedom from, but still ruled by the empire. So Republican freedom, though it's never discussed among people in the IT industry as such, is probably the most accurate description of the kind of freedom that many are concerned with. The clearest case is what is now known as vendor lock-in, something which has been at the heart of all the major antitrust suits of the last 4 decades. Lock-in is when a vendor provides hardware, software, or services that by becoming essential to a customer's life or business prevents them from switching to a competitor, right? And becomes therefore an argument for an antitrust case. When people in the industry start to talk about lock-in, the images of chains come out. The imagery of slavery, of coercion, of injustice is thick. It's striking the righteousness with which people in the industry will condemn corporations like IBM or Microsoft for doing what otherwise seems like perfectly justifiable capitalist behavior. And really, in each case, IBM first, then Microsoft, and partially with Apple, and now with Google, this question of lock-in has been at the center of it. And there are many different versions of this, right? So any long-time resident of the contented colony of Apple should be familiar with this, right? The convenience of its products, the ease of use, the language of it just works. They're all ways of assuring the user that there will be no interference with your liberty, right? Don't worry, we're not actually going to interfere with your liberty. And what's more, the devices will actually enable new freedoms, right? The closest sort of contemporary critique offered in these terms, if not exactly the letter of civic republicanism, comes from Jonathan Zittrain, who talks about generative and tethered apps. And here he uses, for instance, the iPhone as an example, and says you have a system where anything that you want to do with that system is open. That makes it a generative system because people are not constrained by arbitrary power, versus something like the iPhone, where any kind of app that you want to produce has to be vetted by Apple, so a tethered device, right? And even if Apple were just to take a blanket policy of saying, yes, anything you create we'll put on the iPhone and in the iTunes thing, then it would still be, in Republican terms, domination. The possibility of arbitrary interference is always there because Apple holds the keys, right? Microsoft's version of this was infamously outed in the 1990s as the embrace, extend, and extinguish approach to the internet. And what they did was to leverage the base of users of Windows by introducing the internet, which they previously had not been allowing their people to use on their computers via Windows. Embrace the internet. Give them features that the internet does not have, right? Extend. And then force others who want those features to switch over to Microsoft, extinguish, right? So Microsoft, in an incredibly bold move, was attempting to become the internet. And it was a kind of concrete expression of how arbitrary domination could have affected even those who were not directly dominated, right? But others who were relying on this open network. And of course, Republican freedom is probably the best designation of what is at stake in the movement known as free software. And here the vision of software as an expressive medium that augments human capacities is very clear, I think. When you read someone like Richard Stallman, the reason he cares about freedom in software is because software is so intimately connected to our ability to think, produce, make, etc., right? And so it's a kind of core part of our capacity, almost a kind of homo faber explanation of these things. And as well as I've made the argument, our ability to speak in the public sphere, right? To actually communicate in the public sphere. And I can go on ad nauseum about this, obviously. So far I've said much about liberty and not much about liberalism. And this is mostly because I no longer really know what people mean by liberalism, to say nothing of neoliberalism. But the way I like to think of it is the way that Foucault does, which is that liberalism is not a theory or a concept or a body of doctrines, but really a particularly effective mode of critiquing existing governmental arrangements. So it's particularly good at every turn saying what's wrong with existing governmental arrangements. And the word liberalism kind of invokes this connection between liberty and democracy, if only because democracy is the only governmental arrangement left standing, bruised and battered, in the wake of critiques of liberalism. And what's important here, however, is that there is an aspect of the Republican tradition which liberalism routinely critiques. It's probably most clearly associated with the famous essay of Benjamin Constant on the liberty of the ancients and the moderns, namely the requirement of civic virtue and participation. Right? So in the Republican theory of liberty, one of the things that is core to that theory is the idea of civic virtue, that people actually participate in the production of freedom. And Mill, and it's actually exemplified in Tocqueville's praise for the New England Town Hall, for instance, right, which he sees as the kind of emblem of a kind of civic republican version of freedom. And Mill called this a school of public virtue, and he had a very nice kind of discussion of it. Liberalism, however, has rejected it on the theory that it cannot be conducted at scale, right? Representative, interest-oriented politics are the only possibility. The town hall is a nice idea, but you can't do it at the level of a nation, right? You can't do it at the level of a planet. This is the critique from liberalism, which has traditionally been quite effective. And I think I raise this issue here because I think the last 10 years of development in information technology have been obsessed with the possibilities for really large-scale participation, for the production, perhaps, of a kind of civic virtue, although it's really obviously very hard to make this case because most of the obsession with social media is essentially an obsession with advertising. But such a claim might be made, given how obvious it is that Silicon Valley has effectively transformed itself into the wing of an advertising industry. But such a claim might be made about the various forms of participatory technologies that are created today, and that there might be good and bad versions of participation around us to think through the possibility of a school of public virtue, as Mill put it. So here's two. There's one, right? This is positive, utopian. Here's negative, dystopian, right? Okay. Positive, negative, positive, negative. So, of course, Occupy Wall Street then represents a kind of a flowering of this school of public virtue in that it represents not just one technology, not just Twitter and Facebook, but a kind of approach to using them all for a particular political purpose, which schools people in the ability to use them to create social change, right? Then, on the other hand, we've got Amazon Mechanical Turk or Samasource, which are crowdsourcing initiatives. Lily's here to tell us all about them if you have questions. She's done a lot of great work on it, which involve providing access to an enormous pool of labor to do very specified micro tasks. Amazon Mechanical Turk will say, identify this picture, and you click on it and you earn 1 penny, and then you do that over and over again. Samasource basically does the same things but brings it to the developing world. Amazon Mechanical Turk brings it to the developing world too, but Samasource is officially about that, all about that. So I think these two versions of kind of what might be happening with participatory technologies are important to think with, because one would want to understand the distinctions between them in order to come down on the side either of civic virtue and its possibilities at scale, or the end of such possibilities, right? The dominance of that by capitalism, the transformation of it into yet more advertising and exploitation of labor around the planet. And I think both of these things are going on right now as these technologies unfold, as they're used in North Africa, as they're used in open access or Occupy movements, as they're used in these crowdsourcing efforts. And so that leaves us then with this return, I think, to the pathological relationship between innovation and freedom and this cycle which I've been trying to suggest exists. And this is sort of summary of where we've been, that what we were inventing and what we got in these cases seems to suggest a cycle, that we were inventing the personal computer to free us from the mainframe, and what we got were proprietary operating systems and incompatible devices and formats. What we were inventing was Unix and open networks to free us to connect and experiment, and what we got were thousands of non-standard, incompatible versions of Unix in the 1980s. We were inventing free software to free us from AT&T and Unix, and here's an interesting twist. We actually got free software. We got a legal revolution. We got something which really works insofar as free software is free software and not open source as something which is wholly and centrally owned by a corporation. And I can say more about that distinction, because I used to say that there is no distinction, and now I think there is a distinction. And then in the 2000s, we have social networks to free us from the tyranny of the internet, i.e. from the madness of having to deal with anonymous people and the ability to create friends instead. And what we have are dozens of incompatible services, Facebook, Twitter, Google, etc., inaccessible social graphs, massive privacy violations for free, and but possibly, maybe, just a school of public virtue. I'll stop there.